Sorry, I guess I was muted. Today I'll talk about kind of week six, which we'll talk about nutrition and feeding. And this is one of the most important parts of beekeeping, and it's also one of the most difficult parts of beekeeping because it's so regional specific. And so, feeding and nutrition differ in the western part of Texas versus the eastern part of Texas. And even though it's really important, it's one of those things where it really depends on your region and kind of knowing, what the bees need in your area is gonna be really important. So, especially for this section, it's really important for you to get to know a mentor, get to know your local beekeeping club, and try to figure out what type of nutrition that your bees will need in your specific area. And so today I'll talk about just kind of general guidelines related to feeding. But it's one thing that as you gain more and more experience with keeping bees, you kind of understand how much you need to feed, when to feed, and things like that. But hopefully I can give you some general guidelines of what to look for and know when to feed and maybe when not to feed. Okay, so we talked, I guess during the first week or second week about honeybee digestion. So I just want to do sort of a quick summary of that. So the digestive system for honeybees are really suited to processing and collecting, both sugar resources, which is primarily coming from the nectar, and then also pollen resources, which contain really the protein source, the antioxidants, the minerals, and vitamins. And so, honeybees' guts have really three major sections. They have the foregut, which in worker bees, they have the crop, the honey crop, which is where honey is stored before it's brought back to the colony and processed. The midgut is very similar to our stomach, where it's dealing with digesting the complex nutrients such as the pollen and nectar into simple nutrients that can be digested and used for, growth and development and even reproduction. And the hindgut is where any of the excretions or anything that's not useful to the honeybee is excreted from the body and unused. Because as time, if those nutrients or toxicities kind of build up in the gut, that can cause some issues to the honeybee. And so each section of the honeybee gut has a specific role. So some are involved with food intake, such as the foregut. The midgut is primarily involved with digestion and nutrient absorption, and the hindgut is mostly for waste removal. So this is example of a worker gut. And just remember that even though workers and queens are genetically exactly the same, their guts are differed based on what they receive during development. And so as workers become specialized, become, workers, they have different features from a queen or even a drone. And probably the major difference between a worker and a queen and even a drone is what we like to call this honey stomach. And so this is within the foregut. So this is esophagus. So when bees are taking in nectar or pollen, it goes to the esophagus into, the honey stomach. And so between the honey stomach and the midgut is this proventriculus, which is basically a filter. So it opens and shuts based on whether the bees want to digest it and process that nectar. And so when bees are going out to the flower sources, they're taking up the nectar and they're storing it in this honey stomach until they can come back and bring it back to the colony, process it, and process it into what we like to call honey. And so if you ever get workers that come in, straight back from the colony from collecting nectar from the flowers, and you squeeze them, there'll be maybe a little drop of syrup that is kind of regurgitated by the bees. And that's because this is stored in this honey stomach. And so this is really unique to the workers, this honey stomach. But in a situation where, let's say, the bees want to digest that and use it for their own individual usage, they open up this proventriculus, which is the valve that goes into the midgut where there's a bunch of enzymes. And enzymes are just basically specific proteins, and their role is to basically break down that sugar, break down that pollen into nutrients that the bees can absorb and use in their body. And so these digestive enzymes are associated with, sugar processing. So processing complex sugars such as starches, sucrose, into simple sugars such as glucose and fructose. There's some other processing enzymes that are involved with making honey pretty much last a very, very long time. And so these digestive enzymes are extremely important for processing the nectar and, using it within the honeybee body. Also within the gut are these Malpighian tubules. These function very similar to kidneys, and they're basically these kind of strings that go in through the hemolymph or the blood system of the honeybees. This processes any toxicity or anything that could be wasteful or cause issues to the honeybees. So it acts very, very similar to a kidney system. And then we have the hindgut. So hindgut basically just processes all the waste materials. And so when bees are taking in a lot of pollen and nectar, there could be things in those resources that could cause issues to the honeybee. And so what they do is they take away any waste from the pollen and the nectar and they excrete it. And so this is kind of simply what a honeybee gut looks like. But like I mentioned, even though, queens have a really small honey stomach, it's not nearly as large as a worker. So that's really the major difference between, a worker, a drone, and a queen. So with larvae are basically just giant guts. So if you actually look at the anatomy of a larva, it's just a huge gut that goes throughout the entire body. And basically the role of the larva is just to eat as much as possible and grow as fast as it can so it can get large and large enough to become an adult bee, whether that's a drone, whether that's a worker, or whether that's a queen. Now, the major difference between, an adult bee versus a larva bee is, they still have this foregut, which is esophagus. They still have this midgut, which is the digestive part. They also have a hindgut, but the midgut and the hindgut are basically closed off from each other. And so basically the larvae are unable to basically defecate within the colony until they kind of go through metamorphosis and start developing into an adult bee. And so that's really why, because for a larva, right, you don't want to, you basically you don't want to poop where you're going to eat, right? And so they have this system in place so they're not defecating in their food because, they're sitting inside their food and they don't want to cause any issues with their eating habits. And so they're really not defecating until they eat all their food. And after that, they defecate, the workers will clean it up, and then the larva will go through metamorphosis. But really, larvae are just giant digestive tubes. Okay, so we talked about this during, I think, the second week, week two, I think February 17th, about cast termination. So I want to cover it kind of briefly because nutrition plays a really big role in whether basically a larva and a fertilized larva becomes either a queen or a worker. And so, if a fertilized egg is laid, which is probably 95 to 99% of eggs laid by the queen, each fertilized egg has a capacity to become either a queen or a worker. And so basically every fertilized egg is on a good trajectory of a queen or a worker until about, age three or day three larva. And at that point, they can either be pushed on the queen trajectory or the worker trajectory. Now, the only way that they're on a queen versus a worker trajectory is depending on how big the cells are and how much food they receive during development. And so let's say in a situation where a colony needs to raise a new queen, they choose one of the young larvae somewhere between 1 and 3 days old, and they want that to become a queen. They make these cells really large so they can feed them 2 to 3 times more food than a worker. And so one good way to think about a worker and a queen is workers are basically starved queens. And so they're receiving a lot less food, 2 to 3 times less food than queens. They're restricted to their food and they become specialized workers. And so even though, queens and workers are really genetically the same, they receive different nutrients during development that allow them to become either a queen or a worker. Now, I get this question a lot. Royal jelly is fed to just queens and worker jelly is fed to workers. What's the difference? And really the nutrients of royal jelly versus worker jelly, which is fed to the workers, are basically the same. And these jellies contain all the major nutrients that the bees need to grow and develop either into a worker or a queen. And even drones are fed a very similar like jelly substance, and the nutrients that drones receive are basically the same as, queens and workers. But this jelly is basically like a milk. And this milk contains all the major nutrients, whether those macronutrients like proteins, sugars, lipids, and even micronutrients like antioxidants, vitamins, and minerals. And so royal jelly contains about 6 different types of proteins. They contain sugars, whether those are sucrose or simple sugars like glucose and fructose. It contains water and lipids. So basically has everything it needs to develop into either a queen or worker. Now, really the major difference between royal jelly and worker jelly is, they're just fed more. So queens are fed 2 to 3 times more food than workers. And so workers, I mean, the really great way to view them are basically starved queens. And so, queen will receive about 360 to 400 microliters of jelly, whereas workers will be fed about 150, so about half the amount of food versus queens. But if you look at just the content of the jelly, they're basically exactly the same. So what are the major nutritional requirements for bees? And I know we talked about this, 3, 4 weeks ago, but there's really three major nutrients that bees need to grow, develop, and survive. The number one is pollen. So pollen is really the only protein source bees are bringing in. And so pollen contains all the proteins that bees need, but it also contains a lot of the vitamins and minerals and antioxidants that bees need to not only grow, survive, but also has a lot of other important functions. So these antioxidants are used to, store sperm and the spermatheca for long periods of time. These antioxidants are used for, workers transitioning from, nursing all the way to foraging. And so these antioxidants for the protein are really important for growth and development of a honeybee colony. And I think a lot of times we think about pollen as just a protein source, but it contains a lot of other important things that the bees need. Nectar is the major sugar source that the bees collect from flowers. So this nectar contains really the sugar that the bees need to convert into honey and use for not only the growth of the colony, but also, drawing out foundation and overwintering. And so nectar is a really important sugar source. And as I talked about, there's a lot of differences in the nectar, and so not all flowers are the same. Some flowers produce different types of protein. Some flowers produce different types of nectar. Some flowers only provide pollen sources for bees. And so there's a lot of differences in the type of, sources the bees collect from the flowers. And just remember that, honeybees specifically are collecting, these resources from multiple flowers. And so unlike some other solitary bees or other native bees, they're collecting, resources from a lot of different flowers. And in some cases, 180 to 200 different flowers. And so they're getting these nutrients from a lot of different sources because not all flowers are made the same, and flowers have differences in their nutritional quality. Water is another important resource. And so bees are primarily getting the water from the nectar. And so nectar is basically a mixture of, water and sugar. But bees can also collect water from puddles or, water sources like rivers. And so this water can be really important not only for processing food, but also can be really important for ventilating and keeping the colony cool. Now, I guess I did mention, propolis, but propolis is more on, the individual colony. So the colony is collecting propolis to, coat the colony and produce antimicrobial properties to keep the bees, I guess, free from any pest pathogens and diseases. But we think about just the major nutritional requirements that the bees actually consume and use. It's basically pollen, nectar, and water. So what are the nutritional requirements for bees? I know I showed this graphic, I think, last week or a few weeks ago, but it's really important to know really the major life stages of a honeybee colony throughout a year and trying to understand, what stages do the bees need nutrients like pollen and nectar, and what stages are the bees fine and you don't have to worry about feeding. And so honeybees go through, like I mentioned, four major stages, stage one, two, three, and four. And so for stage one, this is, pretty much the dormancy phase for bees. And in most situations, you don't need to feed your bees. Your bees should have enough nutrients to make it through the winter. But there are some situations where, if you don't feed your bees enough or they don't have enough sugar to make it through the winter, you may need to supplement your bees, in the middle of the winter. And, with honeybees, when especially in Texas, is we have, these 3, 4 winters where, the middle of December and January, we can get these huge temperature spikes up to, 60, 70, 80 degrees. And those situations, it kind of tricks the bees in thinking that, hey, spring is here, we need to start brooding up. And in those situations, they might go through their honey stores really quickly, and you might need to supplement them, especially they go through the honey stores. And a lot of times this kind of depends on really the type of line that you're using. And so Italian bees, for example, they like to brood up really heavily in the winter if there's a warm spell. And so you may need to feed these more than maybe like a Russian or Carnival in stock. So kind of depends on the type of bees that you're buying and depends on how fast they're going through those stores. So I've managed Italian bees before, and I've had enough weight to make it through the winter in October, but then we have those really warm fall days or warm winter days where the bees go through their stores really quickly. And in those situations, you might want to add like a sugar brick or a fondant to help them make it through the winter. But what's nice about here in Texas is we have some pretty warm days, and so if you have a few days of really warm weather, you can open up the colony and feed them again to put on a bit more weight. Stage two. So stage two is what we're entering right now. And so whether you have colonies already or whether you're getting colonies pretty soon, this could be a really important time to feed your bees. You know, they're going through this rapid growth stage where the queen's starting to lay eggs, the colonies start to grow really rapidly, and you may need to supplement your colonies to help them make it through the spring and grow as fast as they can. But just remember that one good thing about stage two, especially here in Texas and certain parts of Texas, is there's a lot of resources around. There's a lot of pollen, there's a lot of nectar, and so kind of depends on your region whether or not you need to feed. And so, I know for our bees here in East Texas, we probably feed them maybe 2 to 4 gallons in the spring, depending on what they need. Stage three. This one's a bit more complicated because typically you have honey supers on. There's a lot of resources coming in, and one thing you'll learn about stage three is you don't want to feed when you have honey supers on, because if you're feeding during honey supers and you're overfeeding, that can be stored where the honey is, and your honey can be a mixture of the sucrose or the sugar solution that you're feeding and the honey they're bringing in. And so it's really important not to overfeed during stage three while not feeding at all. Because if during stage three, if your colony stored a lot of nectar and stored a lot of honey in their supers, then you may not need to feed at all. Now, stage four is when your colony is preparing for the winter. And so this is when your colonies are, going from maybe 10 to 20 frames of bees all the way to maybe seven frames of bees to make it through the winter. And especially if you're pulling honey supers off, you may need to feed more sugar to the bees to put that weight on and help them prepare to make it through the winter. And so stage four is probably the most important time for feeding, especially if you did extract and pull the honey off and you need to put more weight on the colony. But yeah, like I mentioned, it's this one's kind of complicated, like feeding is, because it really depends on your area. So if you're in West Texas, there may not be as much resources available in the spring or the fall. And so you may need to feed more to put more weight on the colony and help them brood up and survive throughout the entire year. And so this is really depends on your area and your region. And that's why it's really important to get to know a local beekeeper that's experienced and get to know your local club because they might have specific recommendations based on where you're located. Okay, so when is feeding required? I know I think 3, 4 weeks ago we talked about, colony inspections and we talked about brood pattern. And what they always look for is, the colony size and the brood pattern because it can really inform whether or not you need feeding or not. And so we talked about this brood pattern. And so if you have a really spotty brood pattern, especially now in the spring, if it kind of looks like this, where the brood pattern is maybe a one or a less, there's not a lot of eggs or brood, but there's clearly a queen in the colony. This could be a situation where you might want to feed more to help to get more nutrients to the bees so they can start brooding up and have a more solid brood pattern. Because in situations where there's a lack of pollen or resources available, what the bees will do is they'll actually go back and cannibalize the young eggs and larvae because the bees basically know that there's not as many resources out in the area. And so they need to cannibalize that to sustain the larvae that are still in the colony. And so sometimes I'll see when there's not a lot of pollen or resources coming into the colony, I'll see a lot of that cannibalization and I'll see a really poor brood pattern like this. And in this situation, I would recommend, feeding a bit more to help them push through that really poor brood pattern. But if you have a really great brood pattern like this, where it's very, very solid, the queen's missing very little spots, and there's a lot of young brood and larvae, that's a good sign that there are enough nutrients in the colony and the bees are doing really well. And so in this situation, you probably don't need to feed. You can if you want to, but you also don't want to overfeed. One thing I also look for is, the young developing larva. So, if I see larva that's somewhere between 1 to 3 days old and I see a big pool of jelly underneath them, that's a good sign that there's enough nutrients to sustain that larval growth and that brood development. And oftentimes when I see, like a pollen dearth or a nectar dearth, that larva will be in these kind of dry pools where there's not a lot of food being fed to them. In that situation, you might want to feed more to have those more larger pools for the brood to develop in. And a lot of you are probably new beekeepers, and so you may not know exactly what these pools look like. But if you do any queen rearing, you know exactly what I'm talking about, where the larva is really dry and it's harder to graft from those. And that's a situation where we might want to feed more. One thing I always look for, is there space and is there not space? And so if I see a colony and I keep honey on, especially during the winter, and there's a lot of frames that look like this, where it's a lot of these, white cappings, the honey super still really, really full, it's really heavy still, then the bees definitely still have more enough honey to make it through the spring. And so if you have a lot of honey coming out of winter, you may need to feed less because there's more stores on the honeybee colony. And so it really depends on how much honey you're keeping on the colony through the winter, whether or not you need to feed more or less during the spring. And so some beekeepers may only extract and pull a little bit of honey in the fall and keep a lot more on to make it through the winter. And these situations you may need to feed less. But if you're pulling a lot of honey in the summertime and your colonies are really way coming out of the winter, you may need to feed more. And one way to know about that is by looking at the frames. And so if you have a lot of frames that look like this, where they're practically empty, you don't have a lot of honey still stored in the colony that are in these white cappings or even kind of darker cappings. And I mean, that's a really good sign that you may need to feed more to put more weight in the colony and help them make it through the summertime. But also, you definitely don't want to overfeed. And so I think with a lot of new beekeepers, they tend to overfeed because they're not sure of how much to feed and when to feed. And if you overfeed, the bees will basically process that honey as soon as possible and start storing it in these cells where the queen's laying eggs. And so if you're feeding a lot and you see a lot of nectar stored where the queen's laying eggs in the brood boxes, that's really a good sign that you're overfeeding and you may need to add more space. And so if you see a lot of, especially in the brood boxes, you see a lot of nectar stored in the brood boxes, and there's not a lot of open spaces. You can either, kind of move those frames around to different colonies, or you can add more space, and they'll move that honey or that syrup where the queen's laying eggs to where the supers are. So yeah, I mean, really in a situation, I mean, if you're overwintering colonies that look similar like this, and you probably won't have large colonies like this, I'd say for most beekeepers in Texas, you probably have two double deep brood boxes. This is where the queen's laying eggs, and this is where all the brood is, and then maybe one honey super, maybe two honey supers. This is probably the typical configuration. But if you're coming out of the spring and you have boxes that look like this, and the top super is full of honey and it's really heavy, maybe 40 to 50 pounds, that's a good sign that you probably have enough bees or enough sugar to make it through the spring as your bees are bringing in more nectar and bringing in more pollen. But if you have bees like this, where it's maybe you're managing bees in a deep and a half or medium box, and they're really light, the situation we might want to feed more to put more weight in the colony and provide them more resources to make through the year. And so one thing I typically do is I'll take this handle and I'll kind of tilt it slightly to see how heavy it is. And if the weight's similar to what you buy them, so like empty boxes, this situation where the colonies are really light, you may want to feed them more to put more weight in the colony and help them brood up. And so one thing that I'm really looking at is what does the brood pattern look like? Is it really spotty? And is the colony really light? Because if so, you may need to feed more sugar and pollen for these bees. And so it's I mean it's really hard to I guess tell beekeepers like, hey, this is a heavy, this is a light colony. But if you know what empty boxes feel like, that'll give you an idea about what a colony feels like when it's light versus really heavy. Okay, so protein feeding. When to feed protein or pollen patties or open feeding? What are the situations when to provide some sort of protein supplement? So nutrition requirements, the first thing is pollen. So bees are collecting, really the average colony. collects about 312 pounds of pollen annually. So that's a lot of pollen. And for each protein patty, that's about 1 pound. So you can imagine that you're only providing a very small amount of pollen to the bees that they're actually collecting annually. And so you put in that perspective, the bees are collecting pollen from a lot of different sources, and we did some analysis on pollen where they're collecting maybe 10 to even 100 different pollen sources from different flowers. And so what's great about honeybees is they're really great at finding pollen sources from, a 1 to 3 mile radius. And if there's a lack of pollen, then they may fly longer distances to collect enough pollen to sustain their colony growth. And so even if you're in an urban environment or whether you're in a rural environment, just know that the bees will probably collect enough pollen to sustain their growth. But there are going to be some situations where you might want to supplement your colonies, especially if there's a lack of pollen coming in. But I will say, especially here in Texas in the spring, the bees are bringing a lot of pollen into the colony, and there's a lot of pollen sources, especially here in East Texas. I'm not sure about, other parts of Texas, but there's probably enough pollen coming in that can sustain your colony growth and your survival. Now, the pollen, it really depends on the type of pollen. So the protein content of pollen can vary somewhere between 2.5% all the way to 61%. And so really that means is, if your bees are bringing in a lot of different pollen sources, they're gonna have differences in nutritional quality. And so, for example, like sunflower pollen has a really low protein content and has a low quality, whereas some other pollen sources like crepe myrtles have really great pollen. Almonds have really great pollen. They have a higher protein content. And so just know that not all pollen's created the same, and each flower produces different types of pollen. And even the same flower can produce different amounts of protein that pollen seasonally. So in the spring versus summertime, that can definitely change. And so, that's why it's really important for bees to have a lot of wildflowers and a lot of different flower sources available to collect different types of pollen. But as I'll get into the next slides too, is there's essential amino acids that the bees need to collect that they cannot really create inside their bodies. And so they need to collect that all externally from different flower sources. And so that's why it's really important to have a wide diversity of flowers so the bees can get all those essential amino acids, all those essential proteins to sustain their growth and survival. Now, just perspective. So, if a bee wants to rear one larva to an adult, they require somewhere between 25 milligrams to 37 milligrams. And so, really, the majority of this pollen that's being collected is being going directly into the larva. And if queens are laying 2,000 eggs per day, each of these eggs need 37 milligrams of pollen. And so that adds up really quickly. And so that means that the bees need a lot of pollen and a lot of resources to really support that brood development. And that's one situation where you see a really poor brood pattern. You see the queen maybe laying eggs, but you come back the next day and they're cannibalized or gone. That situation where there may not be enough pollen available for the bees to sustain all this larval growth and sustain all the eggs that queens are laying per day. And so, a lot with, egg laying really depends on the pollen that the bees are bringing in. And so, we always we always say that, queens lay 1,000, 2,000 eggs per day. And that's really dependent on how much pollen and proteins coming into the colony because the bees can really sense how much pollen they need and they collect accordingly. So when bees are collecting pollen, so they're going out to the pollen, they're collecting it on the back of their legs called the corbiculate, and they're bringing it back. But in order to make that digestion really easy, is they break it down into a substance called bee bread. So bee bread is basically fermented pollen. So what the bees do is they bring the pollen and they pack them inside the cells, and then they regurgitate, enzymes and sugar and yeast to really ferment this pollen into something that's more digestible because pollen in the flowers have this really hard coat that make it harder to digest for the bees. And so what they do is they add these enzymes to basically break open the pollen, break open the protein, and allow it to be easier to digest for bees. And so bees really are unable to process, this pollen directly from the flowers. They need to ferment it and put it into a form where they can consume it and then digest it in a way. And so what bees will do is they'll pack a bunch of different pollen into the cells until it's fully capped. So if you actually open up a cell that has bee bread, you'll see a lot of these different layers of bee bread. And based on the colors, these are, different types of pollen that's being brought into being brought into the colony. And so for this one, you see a mixture of kind of greenish, grayish pollen, some orange pollen. This one has a little bit of purple pollen. And so they bring a lot of different pollen sources across the landscape. And just know that the pollen color doesn't really correlate to the flower color. And so, for example, if you have red buds, for example, their pollen I mean, won't be that kind of reddish purplish color. It'll be different. And so, just know that bees are bringing in a lot of colored pollen. That doesn't necessarily mean that's coming from the flower that's blossoming with that same color. It differs. But what they're basically doing is they're adding the sugar, the yeast to ferment this pollen into a source that's more digestible for the bees. So these are well, so I mean, for honeybees, there's about 23 amino acids, but 10 are really essential to honeybees. And these are the 10 essential amino acids. And just remember that, pollen has different types of amino acids. And so that's one reason that bees have to collect a bunch of different pollen sources to get all these essential amino acids. Now, when you talk about amino acids, there's essential and non-essential. What essential means is these are amino acids that the bees can't produce inside their bodies. And so the only way that the bees can get these amino acids is by collecting them from pollen sources at the flowers. And so the bees need to collect all these amino acids to support brood development, to support, queen egg laying, to support, drones, support everything within the colony. And so they need to collect all these from the flowers. Whereas the other non-essential amino acids, these are things that bees can actually internally produce inside their bodies. So these are kind of the proportions of amino acids required compared to tryptophan, which is a common amino acid. And so the higher the numbers, the more the bees need to really thrive, survive, and develop. And so the ones that the bees need a lot is leucine, valine is really important, arginine, isoleucine. So these are really important amino acids, especially valine. Valine is one of the most important amino acids for flight. And so the bees use this valine amino acid to fly and collect pollen and nectar resource. So valine is one of the most important amino acids that bees have. But yeah, I mean this all means that all these are really important amino acids that the bees can only collect from the flowers and are essential for everything related to honeybees. So protein supplements. So I get a lot of questions about what type of protein supplements you should use. And the one thing to consider is a 23 to 30% crude protein content is optimal for feeding. And so if your goal is for bees to brood up and produce a lot more brood inside the colony, you want to have protein supplements to have somewhere between 23 to 30%. And so you're looking for something that's, at least 20% protein content if possible. Now, I mean, there's a lot of different protein supplements available on the market. Some vary in types of protein, the amount of protein content. And so trying to find ones that have this higher protein content is really important, especially when the colonies are brewed up, especially for a poor brood pattern, where you want the colonies to grow larger. But the one thing I always look for too is protein content isn't always the same, right? We're looking at just protein content, but there's a lot of protein supplements that use artificial proteins in their supplements. So they're not using natural pollen or natural resources the bees would normally consume. And so one thing I always recommend is try to find protein sources that actually use, natural pollen. So, their protein's not coming from soy or coming from a different protein source. They're actually using natural pollen they collected. And so, when I'm using a protein patty, I'm looking for that natural pollen if possible. And if you do decide to make your own protein supplement, you can either put a pollen trap in your colony and make your own, or you can buy protein. But just remember that if you're buying, protein from a store to make your own, just know that sometimes that protein can have a lot of pesticides or things that are toxic to the bees. And so that's why it's really important if you're buying, pollen source that it's either tested or you're doing your testing already. So when I'm playing a protein patty, especially here in Texas, we don't need as much protein supplements because there's so much pollen coming in, especially in the spring. So, I tend to feed a lot less protein patties here in Texas versus other parts of the country. And so when I managed bees in North Dakota and Minnesota, there wasn't a lot of protein in the spring. And so I'd feed maybe, 1 to 2 pounds of protein patties in the spring to help the colonies brood up. But here in Texas, that's probably less necessary. But like I mentioned with everything, it kind of depends on your area. So if you're in the northern part of Texas or in the Panhandle, you may need to feed more proteins versus East Texas, where we have a lot more proteins and a lot more pollen coming into the colony. So these are two different ways to feed your colonies. We have dry feeds and protein patties. Probably the most common way to feed your bees protein is through these protein patties. They're basically mixed with sugar, sometimes mixed with pollen, but oftentimes an artificial protein, and they're fed in these kind of patty-like forms. And so you open up the colony and you put them on top of your colony. Now, typically these protein patties are about 1 pound. And so when I talk about how many pounds to provide to your bees, I'm going to refer to them as pounds. And so each colony or each patty has about 1 pound. Whereas dry feed, you have these containers and you put this dry protein into the containers. And so the bees are actually flying, collecting the pollen, and bringing it back to the colony. And so there's a lot of cost and benefits of using a dry feeding method versus a protein patty method. I guess I tend to prefer a protein patty because you're controlling how much being fed to each colony. And so the weaker colonies, especially with dry feeding, may collect less protein because they're being outcompeted by the larger colonies. And so you can control exactly how much being fed to each colony by using protein patties. But also with dry feeding, there's a lot of disadvantages such as spreading diseases, increased robbing, and so dry feeding can be a really great method, but just know there's some downfalls and disadvantages of it. So this is dry feed, so Alter B. So this says it has 58% of this crude protein. And so like I mentioned, you want to feed them at least 20% if possible. And so this dry feed has about 58% of crude protein. And so you're getting enough protein in the colony. And I'm not sure the exact formulation. It says contains no natural pollen. So this formulation doesn't contain any natural pollen. And so you can actually buy, pollen and feed them that way. But just know that a lot of these sources don't actually have natural pollen in them. And so I think it contains mostly soy. And so you look at this, for example, it has a lot of fats, some vitamins, but mostly soy protein and other types of protein. So, this protein, obviously it's important for colonies, but you want to have the right protein because of those 10 essential amino acids. So really the cost of using dry feeding is inconsistent uptake. You can't control exactly how much pollen is being taken up by each colony. And so obviously the larger colonies, they have a larger workforce, they're bigger, and so they have more foragers that will collect most of the pollen, whereas the weaker colonies may be outcompeted by the larger colonies. And so you're unable to control how much each colony is being fed. Increased robbing. And so if you set up these dry feeding stations, for example, you might have increased robbing. So you have a lot of bees that are being trained to the site, and once you take that away, you have a lot of bees kind of flying around trying to find that protein source. And so, you have a lot more robbing behavior when using this dry feeding method. And then the one major downfall is really the disease transmission. And so if you're only managing, a few colonies, for example, this may not be as big of an issue, but just remember that if you're setting up these dry feeding stations, not only are your bees going to the dry feeding stations, but also your neighbor's bees. And if your neighbor's bees have, a lot of viruses or diseases, those can be directly transmitted to all the bees collecting from that source. And so, even though dry feeding can be a really great method because you're feeding a really high protein content, that there's some really major downfalls for using dry feeding. So I personally don't ever use dry feeding. I know a lot of beekeepers do, but I think the costs really outweigh any of the benefits. Okay, so the Honeybee Health Coalition, which is a nonprofit organization, their goal is to develop standardized methods for beekeepers across North America, whether it's US or Canada. And they have a recent nutrition guide to help inform beekeepers about different nutritional feeding protocols to help beekeepers, whether you're a small scale beekeeper or whether you're a commercial beekeeper. And so they made a list of all the different protein patties. They talk about the product name. So when you go into Daydent or Man Lake or Healthy Bees or Global Patties, all these different companies, you kind of know the company name, the manufacturer, and the crude protein content. So remember looking for something that's at least 20% if possible. And then also talk about the crude lipid. So one thing that the bees are collecting from the protein is also the fats, not only the proteins but also the fats. And so you want basically a protein patty that has more of the fats if possible. And then these are different notes based on the manufacturer. And so I typically try to feed the global patties. One thing I love about global patties is they're using, 50% from the pollen. And so they actually add natural pollen to the global patties. And so I see the bees really consuming the global patties and eating a lot of it. But just remember that they're only, I mean, this is less than 20%. So they're only getting 50% of their proteins from global patties, the crude protein content. And so in this situation, you might want to feed two to get up to 20% if possible, but just know that this is a really great product because it has natural pollen. I've never used bee pollen aid before. I've heard a little bit about it, but I've never personally used it. But one thing they add is yeast. So yeast has a lot of really important nutrients and vitamins like vitamin B that can be important for the bees. And so by adding this natural yeast, it can make it more desirable by the bees and allow them to consume it even faster. Global patties, so they either come in 15% or 4%. And so I'm not sure the scenario we use kind of 4%. I typically use the 15% if possible, so one that has a higher protein content. Uh, this healthy bees use spirulina algae-based protein. So instead of pollen, they use, algae basically as their major protein. But just remember that, even though algae may have a lot of nutrients that the bees need, protein is probably the best source if possible. But then if you look at a lot of these other sources, so AP23, which is a Dadan product, has a really high crude protein content, 4 to 7%, but doesn't contain the natural pollen. AP23 has Honeybee Healthy, which is basically essential oils that make it more desirable for the bees. And this contains, high fructose corn syrup and essential oils. And so that's one reason it has a lower, protein content. And so if you want your bees to brood up, this probably isn't the best protein patty for you. Winter patties, so these ones are basically contain less protein because as your bees are going through the winter, you don't want to have as much protein in these patties to help them push through the winter. Protein patties are really important for brooding up, not necessarily the winter. But if you're looking for some kind of protein patty, if your colonies are really light, this could be a really great product. And then just a few other ones, so soy based, but there's really few I mean, there's really few protein patties that contain natural pollen. The only one I really know about is global patties. These are probably the major list. I know that Man Lakes products doesn't contain any protein. They use mostly soy-based proteins, and so it kind of depends. But if you go to this graphic, it'll show you all the different protein patties on the market. This is about a year old, so maybe some new ones on the market that they don't list. But if you want to look at the manufacturer and the crude protein content, this is a really great resource to find those. So when I feed protein, and this is kind of depends on your area, but you might want to feed 1 pound of protein during stage two, so March or June, or 1 pound in July or August. But really for stage two, especially here in East Texas, we don't need to provide any protein patties. And so, if you're living in East Texas, you may not need to apply protein patties. Like I'm not doing that at all. It depends how poor your brood pattern is, or if your colony is really weak and you want them to build up really fast, you may want to feed a protein patty. But especially in the eastern part of the state or even parts of the state where they're bringing a lot of pollen, this is probably unnecessary. But if you're living in like the Panhandle, for example, or if you're living in, West Texas, where there's a lot less pollen coming into your colony right now, you may want to feed them a protein patty to help them brood up and help them push through maybe a poor brood pattern. So, like I said, this all kind of depends on your area. And also depends on how much pollen they're bringing in. So if you're inspecting your colony, you see a lot of bee bread. So you see, frames full of bee bread. That's a sign that they're bringing in a pollen. If you see a lot of bees coming back and forth with pollen on the back of the legs, that's a good sign that pollen's coming in. And so really, if you see a lot of bees bringing pollen back in, then these protein patterns are probably unnecessary. And stage three, I might feed 1 pound of protein, but depends on how weak my colonies are. And so if my colonies have a lot of viruses, a really spotty brood pattern, I may feed somewhere between 1 to 3 pounds of protein to help them brood up and get bees that are ready for the winter. And so one thing I want for the winter is kind of fat, healthy bees. Because the bees are transitioning from summer bees, which live 21 days, to winter bees, which live 3 to 4 months. And so I might feed some protein to kind of fatten up those bees and get them ready for the winter. But it really depends on the state of your bees and your specific location. The one thing to consider here in Texas is small hive beetles. And so Typically with 1 pound, and especially when there's so much natural pollen coming in, the bees prefer the natural pollen versus the protein patties you provide into the colony. And so just remember that if you put a protein patty on the colony and there's a lot of protein coming in, the bees probably won't consume that whole protein patty. Now, if there's a lot of lack of protein coming into the colony, they may consume that within 1 or 2 days. But that protein patty's on the colony for, over 4 days, upwards to a week. That means the bees have enough protein and they're kind of ignoring that protein patty. And the problem, especially here in Texas, is the small hive beetles. And so small hive beetles will start reproducing in these protein patties, start developing, and you see a lot of those kind of worms developing in the protein patties. And so this is what a protein patty looks like with the small hive beetle eggs. They're really hard to see unless you have a microscope, but this is sort of what it looks like. And if these protein patties aren't consumed within maybe 4 to 5 days, you'll see a lot of larvae kind of growing on the protein patties, and it'll kind of start fermenting it, start becoming really gross. And so typically, if I'm feeding protein patties, I'll store them in the freezer. First off, because you store them at room temperature, the small hive beetles can get in and start, ruining your protein patties. So I typically store them in the freezer, or even a fridge is fine. And I might feed them. Let's see, I have a picture of it. I might feed them maybe 1/3 to 1/4 of this protein patty at a time and see if they consume it or not. Because if they're not even consuming 1/4 of it, then you're basically wasting money on these protein patties. And so I'll just feed a small percentage right away to see if they consume it. And if they're consuming it really quickly, that's a good sign that they might need more bees or might need more pollen. But you definitely don't want to overfeed because a small hive beetle will take over and start ruining your protein patties. So one thing you can do is this was a Practical Bee Award that we launched, I think, 2019 by the American Beekeeping Federation. And this beekeeper in South Carolina, he had a lot of issue with small hive beetle, and so he developed this device where it's basically this wired mesh. So wired mesh on this wooden this wooden dowel that goes around here. And what happens is you put the protein patty on top, and that allows the bees to basically go underneath this and remove any small hive beetle. And so you can buy this at any bee supply store. I know they sell at Data now. They sell these at Man Lake and Bee Supply. And so you can buy these at really any type of bee supply store now, which is really great. And so if you're providing protein patties and you want to purchase one of these, that's a really great thing to have because you can keep these protein patties on longer and it actually allows the bees to go underneath and remove any small hive beetles. And so if you're providing proteins, these devices are pretty cheap now, and so it could be something that you could purchase and use. Okay, next we'll get into sugar feeding. So why feed, sugar syrups? There's really three major reasons. There might be some more, but these are really the three major reasons. So one is a dry out foundation. And so especially for beekeepers that are getting, bees here soon, probably in April into May, you're starting your colonies off with foundation. So that means you're starting out with plastic foundation. It may have a few coats of wax on it, but the bees still have to produce wax and dry out that foundation. But in order to produce wax and dry out that foundation, the bees need a lot of syrup because it's very energetic and requires a lot of resources to produce wax and draw that wax out. And so if you're starting with a 4 frame nook and the rest are basically this foundation, you may want to feed more to help the bees draw out this foundation. And so, you know, I typically use the guidelines of maybe, 2 to 4 gallons of sugar syrup in the spring, depending on your colony. But if you're starting with a lot more foundation and you want to draw that out, you may want to feed more to help the bees draw out that foundation, especially when there's not a really intensive honey flow. Now, if you're in an area, maybe South Texas, maybe the Houston area where you have a really strong tallow flow, or if you're in certain parts of Texas where you have a really strong honey flow, feeding isn't that big of an issue. But if you don't have a really strong honey flow, then this foundation won't be drawn out and it'll take a long time. And so I know here in East Texas, we don't have a very strong honey flow. And so it's really hard to dry out a lot of this foundation. And so in our situation, we might want to feed more often to help dry out that foundation. Another reason for feeding sugar syrup is to stimulate brood production. And so if you have a very spotted brood pattern, if the bees seem to be cannibalizing a lot of those eggs, that situation you might want to feed not only protein supplements but also sugar syrup to help the bees brood up. But even if your bees are really kind of small coming out of the winter, you may want to feed a bit more to help the bees brood up and grow faster. And so, feeding can be a really great way to help the bees brood up and grow. And then the final reason is prepare for the winter. And so one reason that bees basically store so much honey is because they want to hoard that honey and have enough sugar resources to make it through the winter. And so here in Texas, we recommend, 30 to 40 pounds of sugar to make it through the winter. In moderate temperatures, maybe parts of the Midwest, 50 to 60 pounds, but if you're in the upper Midwest, maybe about 80 to 90 pounds. And so fortunately for Texas, they only need to store 30 to 40 pounds. But if you're extracting a lot of honey and pulling a lot of that honey off, you may to feed the bees, put more weight on, and have enough sugar to make it through the winter. And so these are really the three major reasons for feeding, especially here in Texas. So what's the major differences between, sucrose or fructose versus honey? So honey contains mostly fructose and glucose. These are simple sugars. And so sucrose is basically a complex sugar which contains a glucose and a fructose. And so these enzymes break these up into simple sugars called fructose and glucose. And so we actually analyze honey. It contains mostly the simple sugars like fructose and glucose, and maybe a little bit of sucrose. The water content is really low because the bees want to lower the water activity. So one, it eliminates a lot of the pathogens and growth on the honey, but also allows the bees to store the honey for long periods of time because the bees never know when they need to kind of get into those honey stores. And so it makes sure that honey lives and stays fresh for longer periods of time. And so typically the water content somewhere between 17 to 20%. Um, Typically, we recommend having your honey between, this percentage so you don't have any fermentation or any bacterial growth on your honey. And bees are really great about, monitoring that. But depending on your areas, if you're a really high humid area, it may be really hard to get that water content down to a place where your honey doesn't ferment. But the water content really does depend on, I guess, the type of sugar source you're collecting. So I do know some honey sources, some plants, their water content can be over 20%, and that honey doesn't ferment. But then some honeys, for example, if they're above that 20% water content, they starts fermenting really quickly. So kind of depends on your honey source and where your bees are collecting, nectar from. But just in general, the general guidelines is somewhere between 17 and 20%, 18% if possible. Honey is very, very, very acidic, so it has a pH of somewhere between 3.5 and 4.5, and that really helps with preservation. And also with a more acidic, that pretty much, pushes back and eliminates any bacterial growth into the honey. And so bees do a really great job of making honey in a way that not only prevents fermentation on the honey, but also prevents any bacterial growth or any pathogens that can be deadly or basically ruin the quality of the honey. Now, sugar syrup, it kind of depends on the type of sugar syrup you're buying. And so a lot of sugar syrups are blends. And so you may buy a 55 blend, for example, that contains 55% high fructose corn syrup and the rest is sucrose. But if you're just buying, refined sugar and mixing with sugar, then you contain mostly sucrose. So in general, I'd recommend using sucrose if possible. I think the bees grow really fast with it, they consume it, and it's sort of a healthier sugar option. But that's not to say that, 55 blend or a blend that does have high fructose corn syrup isn't bad. Just in general, sucrose is a lot better for the bees. It also allows, more brood production. It allows the colony to be healthier, and so in general, sucrose is probably the best option. The water content kind of varies on the type, and so it really depends on one, how you're mixing it. So if you're buying just the refined sugar and you're mixing with water, kind of depends on how you mix it. And as we'll talk about, typically in the spring, we recommend a 1-to-1, sugar to water ratio, but in the fall, a 2-to-1. And so it depends on how thick you make that sugar for the bees, but also how the water content really influences whether the bees use that to brood up or whether the bees use that to kind of store for the winter. And then slightly acidic, so somewhere between 5 and 7. So it's not as acidic as, you know, honey, but still slightly acidic. So really the major difference between honey and some of the sugars that we provide to the bees is the enzyme difference. So enzymes are basically these proteins that have certain functions that allow the basically, I guess these enzymes do have a lot of different functions. So they're proteins that have specific roles. So some of these enzymes, their role is to break complex sugars into simple sugars. So for example, breaking up sucrose into glucose and fructose is a major role of invertase. Now, Now imagine if you have sucrose, for example, and you put it into water. If you let that sucrose sit in water for multiple hours, that water will naturally break down that sucrose into simple sugars like glucose and fructose. But if you add an enzyme, that'll speed that up by 10 to 20 fold. And so even though naturally the water can break down sucrose into fructose and glucose, these enzymes will speed that up and make it quicker. And so what the bees are doing is they're producing these enzymes to speed up the process and make it happen faster. And so probably the major enzyme is invertase. This invertase is added to the honey by the bees to break down sucrose into glucose and fructose. Because the bees want to break that down into simple sugars to allow them to digest it and use it not only for brood production, but also just for growth and health of the bees. And this is really what makes honey naturally sweet is these simple sugars. And so bees, I mean, most of the nectar that's being brought in is sucrose, maybe a little glucose fructose. So this invertase needs to break down that sucrose into these molecules. Another important enzyme is glucose oxidase. So what this glucose oxidase does is it converts glucose into gluconic acid and hydrogen peroxide. So we hear a lot about hydrogen peroxide. It's a common cleaning substance. It's a really great way to desanitize your home, for example. But what bees do is they actually convert this glucose to hydrogen peroxide, and that allows the honey to have some of these antibacterial properties. And so we hear a lot about these stories about honey, lasting on the shelves for, you know, decades to even hundreds of years to even thousands of years in some of the Egyptian tombs. And one reason for that is not only the lower water content of the honey, but because the bees are producing hydrogen peroxide in the honey to help make sure that's antimicrobial and make sure there's no growth onto the honey. And so bees are really great about keeping that honey clean and free of any pests, pathogens, diseases if possible. Another type of enzyme is diastase. So, I mean, another term is amylase. So what this does is it break down starches. So starches are just really complex sugars. So an example of starch would be bread, for example, or potatoes, sweet potatoes. These are all examples of starches. These are complex sugars that need to be broken down into smaller sugars. And so what it does is it breaks down these starches into simple sugars like glucose and fructose. But just remember that with any of these enzymes, it changes with heating. So if you're heating your honey, I guess, too high, or you're heating your honey too much, then that can break down these enzymes and cause some issues within your honey. So, heating can be a really important process and sometimes necessary if you're planning on selling and bottling your honey. But just remember that if you're heating your honey too much, that can break down a lot of these really important enzymes. And so this is really the major difference between if you feed them sucrose versus, honey. A major difference is really the vitamins. And so just like us, we require a lot of vitamins for our growth and our health and our immunity. And so honey contains a lot of these really important vitamins, including the vitamin B. And so vitamin B is something that, bees can only get from pollen. And so for humans, for example, we can't produce our own vitamin Bs. The only way you can get vitamin Bs is by supplements. We can buy vitamin B supplements from the store, or we eat, red meat. That's the only way that we can get vitamin Bs. Now, some plants have vitamin Bs, but not nearly as much as red meat. And so that's why if you're a vegan or vegetarian, you may need to supplement a little bit more to get those vitamin Bs into your system. Now, same thing with honeybees. The only way that bees can get their vitamin Bs is through pollen. And so by bees collecting pollen, they get those vitamin Bs, and that supports their metabolism, their immunity, and their overall health. And so unlike if you're feeding them just straight up sucrose and the bees aren't getting any, honey or nectar from their environment, then they're not going to have these vitamin Bs. But also, honey contains a lot of calcium, potassium, zinc, and a lot of these really important vitamins that bees need. Now, zinc is one of the most important vitamins that bees consume from the honey because zinc helps reduce one oxidative stress. And so as bees are, going through their function, if they're living in their organism, they're more prone to a lot of stress from the environment, like oxidative stress. And this can basically damage their tissues, cause, I mean, in humans, oxidative stress can cause cancer. And so the zinc really helps reduce the stress and supports any cell repair. Honey also contains a lot of antioxidants. And so antioxidants are one thing to reduce any of these kind of free radicals or things that can damage the cells and the tissues. And so antioxidants are probably the most important part for bees. Now, as you can imagine, anything related to honeybee colony can be really stressful. And so, for example, overwintering would be really stressful. And so these antioxidants help reduce that stress and reduce those free radicals and reduce any cell damage. And so what happens when bees are really stressed and consuming a lot of oxygen, that produces free radicals. These free radicals go in, they damage the tissues, they damage the cells. But these antioxidants basically bind to these free radicals and stop them from causing any damage. And so honey contains a lot of these really important antioxidants. So they contain flavonoids, phenolic compounds. And so one thing we've been doing here at A&M is testing different types of antioxidants and whether these can be supplemented to bees. And so one thing we found was acai or acai, I guess, depending on I'm not sure how Texans pronounce acai. I say acai, but I think some people say acai. These acai berries. They contain a lot of the very similar antioxidants that bees naturally consume in pollen and nectar. Also, green tea contains a lot of the same antioxidants, but green tea contains a little bit more. I guess it contains caffeine, and so I'm not sure that's an issue for bees. But one thing we found is by feeding bees, sugar that has some of these antioxidants like acai berries in it, that increases the bees from living. Well, so what we did was you took about 10 worker bees, put them in an incubator, and fed them just straight sugar versus sugar that's antioxidants. And these bees live 21 days just on the straight sugar versus 41 to 50 days on antioxidants. And so we're seeing that antioxidants are really important and that we need maybe to supplement bees with these antioxidants to help the bees survive, grow, and develop. But also honey is very complex. And so these are kind of general guidelines, but honeys have different types of antioxidants, different types of minerals and vitamins, and things like this. And one thing we like to refer to this as sort of the ash content. So ash basically means all the minerals and vitamins in the honey. And so the darker honey tends to have more of this ash content, whereas the lighter honey has less of this ash content. Now, ash can be really important because, like I mentioned, it contains a lot of the antioxidants, these vitamins and minerals that are extremely important for the honeybee colony or even the individual bee. But too high of ash content can cause a lot of issues with the honeybee. And so you want to make sure that your ash content isn't too high, but you want to have a little bit of ash content in your honey. But just remember that each honey is a little different. So if you compare a lot of different honey sources, so this one would have a higher ash content, so more antioxidants, more vitamins, minerals, whereas this one's are very clear. I mean, this might just be sugar. I'm not sure. I just got to take a stock photo, but this probably doesn't have a lot of ash content, so it's missing a lot of those important nutrients. Okay, should you feed honey? So I get a lot of questions about beekeepers that may want to feed their bees honey versus just feeding regular sugar. So if you're an experienced beekeeper, you may have tried this before, or maybe you haven't. And if you want to, you can definitely try this kind of small experiment you can do out in the field. If you have a frame just like this with a whole frame of white wax cappings, and you set this up next to a colony, and then next to it you put like a jar of sugar syrup, like a 1-to-1 sugar to water solution next to it. The bees will never touch this honey. They'll go right to the sugar solution, and they'll use that and bring it back to the colony. Now, you're probably wondering, I mean, if honey's so great, it contains all these important nutrients, it's higher quality, it has more of this ash, why aren't the bees collecting the honey versus the nectar? And one reason for that is because bees store this honey in a way that allow it to be stored for a long period of time. So they're lowering the moisture content, they're, using enzymes to process the honey, and then they're capping in this wax. And so what that does is it makes it easier for the bees to store that honey for longer periods of time, maybe even decades, but it makes it harder for the bees to digest. So in order for the bees to actually take this honey and process it, they actually have to increase the water content of the honey because in this form it's about 17 to 20%. But in order for the bees to use that for their energy and for their eating and digestion, the bees need to add water to it. And so if you just add a frame like this, it takes the bees a lot of energy to actually digest this honey and put water back into the honey. And so sugar syrup is easier to digest. One issue with just feeding straight honey is one, I guess there's really no point of taking honey off, extracting it and adding honey back in, right? It doesn't really make sense at all. So if you plan on feeding bees honey back onto the colonies, I would just keep them on just in general. But two, if you're buying honey from other beekeepers, just know that there can be spores or things that can be, I guess, deadly to a colony within the honey. And so if you are planning on feeding honey back to your colony, I would never buy honey from another beekeeper. Just know that you only want to buy honey from a source that you know about and maybe honey from your colonies. But if you are going to feed honey back to the colonies, I would recommend, mixing it with water to make it easier for the bees to digest. You want to get that water content up, maybe 30 to 40%, so it's easier for the bees to consume and digest. But in general, I wouldn't worry too much about feeding honey back in the colony. I mentioned a lot about the difference between sugar syrup and honey, and yes, there are clear differences between the two. And so the best way to, feed your colonies is to keep honey back on the bees. But if you need to feed, just remember that the bees are still processing that sugar syrup. They're still adding enzymes to that sugar. And even though it's not as high quality as honey, they're still processing it for the bees. And I guess I'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but I think a lot of beekeepers add, vinegar or citric acid to the honey to lower the pH because, honey pH is very acidic. And so they want to increase the acidity of the sugar syrup to make it similar to honey. But just remember that the bees are processing that. They're making it naturally more, more acidic. And so there's really no point of adding vinegar or citric acid because the bees are naturally doing that by themselves. Because the bees still have to consume that sugar, they're going to process that sugar and then store it in a way that they can use. And so um, I wouldn't worry too much about lowering the pH of the sugar syrup. Just feeding them 1 to 1 is more than enough. So these are different types of feeders. So we have the Boardman feeder. So I'm not sure how many beekeepers actually use a Boardman feeder. I really use it, but it's a really great method because you can basically fill up these jars and then you put it on the front of the colony. And so you can fill these up. I'm not sure how much they hold, but you can just kind of put them in front of the colony, and it's really easy to use. You have to open up the colony and feed them that way. But the one issue is it can encourage robbing. So if you're there at the entrance and you have a really strong colony next to it, those bees may be more likely to rob out that honey syrup. And then once those robbers are trained to that colony, they'll actually go into the colony and rob out the rest of the colony. And so, especially if a really weak colony, this can encourage robbing and cause issues with that colony. And so that's really one of the major downfalls. Another downfall is to refill and replace almost daily. So this doesn't fit as much sugar as some of the other options. And so you might have to fill this up and feed them more often than if you just use a frame feeder or other types of feeders. The one thing I didn't mention here is one of the major downfalls is this is exposed to the sun. And as we talk about HMF, which is a very toxic chemical, that can be produced in the sugar. If this is sitting outside for maybe 4 to 5 days and the bees haven't consumed it, I would just dump it out because the sun will get into that honey that'll produce that toxic HMF and it'll actually cause your bees to die. And so if the bees aren't consuming this within maybe a couple days, I would pour this out and replace it with fresh sugar water. I mean, I would always try to use fresh sugar water if possible. But yeah, if you're keeping this on for more than 7 days and you come back and there's still a lot of sugar in them, I would just replace that if possible, especially since it's exposed to the sun and it can cause some issues. Hive top feeders. I've used it a few times. I've used kind of both these different methods. I think they're all pretty practical. It's really practical because for this top one, for example, you actually don't have to open up the colony. It's already on top of the colony, so you don't have to worry about being very invasive during inspections. You don't have to worry about stressing out the bees because you basically pull out the cover and feed them this way. What's really nice about this one hive top feeder is you can feed several gallons at a time. And so instead of just feeding maybe small amounts and feeding them daily, you can feed them large amounts. Another benefit is this isn't exposed to the sun or the heat. And so you don't have to worry about that development of that HMF or that toxic chemical. So this is a really practical method. But just remember that these mesh have to be on really tightly because the bees can go in there and get trapped. And so if you're using one of these and over time these will wear out, you may want to make sure that's tightly closed up so the bees aren't getting trapped and dying inside the sugar syrup. What happens here? I mean, I guess Molly talked about this maybe 3, 4 weeks ago, but the bees will basically go on top of this mesh and start feeding, and then as that sugar gets fed up, they'll go down this mesh and eat more of the sugar syrup. But one of the major benefits is the colony does not need to leave the hive for feedings, and the feedings can be replaced or refilled without encouraging robbing or opening the hole in the colony. So unlike a Boardman feeder, there's less likely of having robbing versus this type of method. Now, if you don't want to buy a hive top feeder, these can be a bit more expensive. You can just use a regular bucket, for example, and place a few holes right here. So you just use kind of a small nail or poke a few holes. I would put maybe 10 or 15 holes. You don't want to put too much because that'll be too much to drip on there. But if you use, but you don't want you don't want too few. So if you only have 5 holes, that'd be more difficult to get the bees. So I'd say maybe 8 or 10 holes, something like that, depending on how big this area is for the bees to feed on. But yeah, for this you can use kind of a regular. I think this is 1 gallon feeder. So 1 gallon is a really good size to use. You can use kind of a quartz jar. You can use any type of jar. But one thing I like about these plastic ones is it's kind of hidden from the sun, and so those UV rays aren't coming in and causing any issue with the honey. So I'd rather use kind of a more transparent bucket if possible because you don't want the HMF to develop in the honey and cause any issues. Now, in most cases, the bees will consume the honey pretty soon after. I mean, within a week, within a day or two. And if your bees aren't consuming all that honey right away, that's a sign that your bees may be having some issues. But yeah, if you know if that honey's sitting on there for long periods of time, that can be problematic. Another type of feeding is barrel feeding, and so I guess I wouldn't recommend this. I guess I've done it before, but I think the costs are similar to pollen feeding, like pollen open feeding, in that it's going to promote more robbing. So the bees are going to be trained to that location and be more likely to rob out other colonies, especially weak colonies. Two, there's going to be more disease transmission because not only are your bees going to this barrel feeding, but also the feral colonies and your neighbors' colonies are coming here. So if there's diseases from those other bees, like viruses and other pathogens, those can be spread to your bees and go back to your colony. So I think this is a really practical, I mean, not practical, but easy way to feed your bees. But there's a lot of downsides and costs for using this type of method. Now, I'm not saying like if you do this that you know diseases spread to your colonies, but there's a higher chance of that actually happening. So yeah, I mean, I guess one of the other downfalls is the stronger colonies will collect more of this nectar, and so you're not going to evenly feed the colonies. So with the weaker colonies may be outcompeted by the larger colonies, and that can cause an issue with the smaller colonies. So I always try to recommend feeding each colony individually because you know exactly how much being fed to each colony and how much more feed each colony needs. Whereas this is kind of a black box. You have no idea how much each colony is actually consuming. Another method is kind of granulated sugars, fondants, or sugar candies. I think this is a really great method, especially in the winter. You know, if you want to make your own fondants, you can definitely provide that to the colony. It doesn't hurt. But it's typically used by beekeepers in the cold winter months to sustain colony size. And one thing I always say is you know, is it necessary to feed sugar bricks or fondants in the winter? Well, you definitely don't want to, right? You don't want to open up the colony in the middle of winter when it's really cold, but you also don't want your colonies to starve, right? And so if your colonies are about to starve, I mean, it's best to open up the colony, even if it is, you know, 20 to 30 degrees, to make sure they have the sugar feed, because if you don't, they are going to starve and die. But you want to make sure that you basically prevent that before it gets to that point. So when you go into the winter, you want to make sure you have enough sugar stores on as possible, makes as enough weight on as possible to help the colonies make through the winter. But in most cases, if you have enough sugar on and enough stores going into the winter, you know, providing a granulated sugar fondant or candy is, you know, not necessary. But if you have a lot of these warm days and your bees are going through your honey stores in the winter, you may need to provide some kind of sugar syrup or some kind of a fondant. Now, I guess I've never used it before, to be quite honest. You know, I never my bees never had to. I think I used them once in Minnesota. And that's really when the bees didn't have enough sugar syrup. They started getting really light, so I had to feed them some emergency feed. But even Minnesota and North Dakota, when it gets really cold, I never had any issues about applying these kind of fondants or granulated sugar. We never have to, even though it's really cold up there. And so, but I will say, like, it's better to open up your colonies in the winter to feed these versus having your colonies starve. So, so one thing I do recommend is trying to use kind of more kind of wetter fondants. And so if you're just feeding on dry sugar, and I'll talk about this during the winter section, it requires a lot more energy and work by the bees to add water content to that sugar, break it down into a digestible way. And so the best way to help your bees is to feed kind of a wetter fondant or wetter sugar. And so if you're just kind of pouring up, granular sugar on top of your colony, that's great, right? You're applying sugar, and especially if they need it, that's great to apply that sugar. But just know it's going to require a lot more water and effort by the bees to break down that sugar. And so if you're going to apply some kind of emergency fondant, I would recommend mix that sugar into kind of with water to make into this fondant and feed on top of the colony to make it easier for the bees to consume and break down. Um, I thought I had a frame feeder, but I guess I have a picture of that. But another way is to add a frame feeder. And so a frame feeder is basically a feeder that replaces a frame. It's basically a trough for the bees. And so these frame feeders can have somewhere between a gallon and a half, and 2 gallons. I typically use the gallon and a half because the 2 gallons are almost too big, and the 1 gallons are almost too small. So I think the gallon and a half are perfect size to go into to the colony. But if you use a 2 gallon, 1 gallon, it doesn't quite fit properly with all the frames. So one and a half seems like the perfect amount. But this is what I typically use. Really, the major downfalls is you have to get a bucket or a special device to feed inside those troughs. So you can get maybe a gas can and feed it filled with sugar, so it's easier to feed them. You can add some kind of funnel to go into the frame feeder, so that's definitely a really great method. One thing I recommend with these frame feeders is to use the cap and ladder feeders, so the bees can crawl in and they don't get stuck in the sugar. If you don't have those cap and ladder feeders, then you maybe add a stick to make sure the bees aren't getting stuck in there. I'm gonna show you a frame feeder because I have a picture for some reason. A cap and ladder feeder. Okay, can you guys see this feeder? I think you can. Let me just share this again.
Yes, we could see it.
You can
And
see, okay.
I like to drop a cork down in each one of those holes.
A cork.
Mm-hmm. No dead
Yeah,
bees.
that's a good idea because sometimes the bees can get stuck on there, even with the cap and ladder feeders. Um, if you don't have these cap and ladder, I mean, I'd recommend buying it regardless. Because it has kind of this mesh in here so the bees can crawl in and consume the sugar syrup. But if you don't have these top ones, you can probably add a few sticks, but just know some of the bees will die regardless. But these cap and ladder feeders work really well. I've never used a cork method, but that can be a really great way to help the bees get some of the sugar. So I think it's a really great method. I recommend probably the gallon and a half. It seems to fit really well inside a colony, but 1 gallon and 2 gallon also work really well. Okay, I'm gonna go back to my presentation here. Do, 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 do. Yeah, so I mean, with anything with feeding, there's definitely a lot of different ways to feed your colonies, and so some people use the top feeders, some people use the Boardman feeders, some people use the frame feeders, and so it kind of depends on your preference. There's a lot of different options out there, and there's probably some I'm missing. So please let me know in the chat if there's a different type of feeding method that you use. Okay, so feeding refined sugar. So I get a lot of questions about can you use brown sugar instead of kind of sucrose or refined sugar? And the answer to that is never. You never want to use brown sugar in any situation. And the major reason for that is because it has a higher ash content. And so it's not as refined as heavily as, sucrose. It has a lot of this kind of brownish ash in it, and that can really impact the digestion of the syrup by the bees. And so you never want to use a brown sugar or a non-refined sugar when you're feeding your bees. So if the sugar says refined sugar, that should be great to use still. So if you plan on, kind of mixing your own sugar solution, so buying bakes of sugar, try to get refined and never use brown sugar. So why can't you use brown sugar? And really the major reason is the ash content. So the ash content is basically all these vitamins, minerals, antioxidants that are found in the sugar. And during the refinement process, what they do is they take out all those that ash, make kind of that white color, and so it's that pure sugar. So, brown sugar, for example, has a lot of that ash still in it, which can be really beneficial, but if it's too high, that can cause a lot of issues with your colonies. So you never want to feed any type of sugar that has a high ash content. Now, honey naturally has a little bit of ash, right? So honey contains about 0.17% ash, so not a lot, but still enough. And this ash content can be really important because it has a lot of the antioxidants, minerals, and things like that. But just remember, as your bees are consuming the sugar, they're adding some ash back into that sugar in a way. So really trust your bees, and your bees will process it in the right way. But these are different types of sugars that you can purchase in their ash content. So most sugars have a really high sucrose content, so 99% for most of these. Brown sugar has a lower sucrose content, but like I said, the bees have enzymes that'll break that sucrose into glucose and fructose. And so I wouldn't worry too much about the sucrose content because the bees will process that honey. But the one thing to look for is the ash percentage. So even raw cane sugar has a kind of a relatively high ash content compared to honey, so 0.3 to 0.6% compared to 0.17% for ash. But remember that you're mixing out the water, so that's gonna be a bit lower. So raw cane sugar could be an option. White refined cane sugar has a really low ash content, so this could be a really great option because the ash content is really low. It's not gonna cause any issue with your colony. But then you look at brown sugar, for example, its ash content is about 1 to 2%. So that's significantly higher than what's contained in honey or even this kind of refined sugar. So 1 to 2% is really high. Um, but remember, I guess I do say honey typically has an ash content of 0.17%, but some honeys are different from each other. So the darker honeys like buckwheat honey, and honeys just like that, they can have a higher ash content. So that could be potentially problematic for your colony. But yeah, when you think about feeding and you think about like, can I use this sugar? Can I use this sugar? I would look at most of the ash content to try to find one that's refined and has a lower ash content of less than, 0.1% if possible. So what is ash? So content is honey is primarily composed of minerals such as potassium, calcium, magnesium, iron, phosphorus. So all these important minerals. And there's definitely a lot of benefits for having these minerals in the colony. So I'm not saying that ash is bad, but too much ash can be really problematic for the colony. And so the major benefits is it has all these important minerals for bee health. And so these minerals are things that the bees can only collect from the environment. And by having these minerals, that improves not only the storage of the honey, but can improve the overall health of the honeybee colony, whether that's a worker or a queen. It can be really helpful for wax production. So some of these minerals are important for helping the bees produce wax to build up comb. They can have different benefits for resistance to diseases. And so some of this ash that can be fed to a colony can increase the immunity of the colony and allow them to kind of fend off a lot of these diseases and pathogens. And then finally, this ash can be really important for brood rearing. And so when I was talking about, adding ash to syrup, I was looking at, acai berries, for example, like buying that powder from Amazon mixed with sugar. And we saw that one not only allowed the bees to live 2 times as long, but increase the brood rearing, increase the health, and increase their resilience to a lot of these diseases. And so ash can be really important. It's something that we should be adding to our sucrose solutions. But there's a lot of cost if you have too much ash and not the right type of ash. So it can cause digestive stress. And so a lot of times when you feed them a lot of ash, or the bees are, feeding on buckwheat honey, for example, you'll see a lot of this dysentery on the side of the colony where it's basically, I guess, clogging up the digestive system. So the bees are excreting a lot of this extra waste because like I said, in the digestive system, the bees are basically breaking down that sugar into things that's usable. But there's too much ash, there can be too much of that unusable substance that the bees have to excrete. And so you might see a lot of more of this dysentery if you have food with a higher ash content. And if you feed your bees brown sugar, you'll definitely see a lot more of this ash and lots of dysentery on the side of the colony. Another cost is increases water demand. And so as you can imagine, the bees are consuming more of that ash, it requires more of that water to basically excrete all this waste. And so the bees might need more water to help them process all this ash inside the syrup. One thing that it can cause issue with winter survival challenges. And so if there's more ash and there's more digestive issues, that can really impact the bees making it through the winter. And so one that's really important is to consider what your bees are storing go through the winter. And so, for example, if your bees are bringing in a lot of buckwheat honey or honey that's really dark and has a lot of ash, that can cause issues for your bees over winter. Now, here in Texas, it's probably not as big of an issue because, I mean, the winters are pretty short, they require less sugar, and so the ash content probably doesn't mean as much. But, if you're in the Midwest, for example, this ash can be a really big problem and cause issues for the bees overwintering. And so I know if we feed our bees and they have a lot of buckwheat coming in, those bees have a really low chance of actually making through the winter. And so the ash content can be a really important factor for winter and winter survival. And so it's really important to think about that a little bit more. So if your bees are bringing in a lot of ash, you might want to maybe pull that honey and then feed them with a sugar solution. Yeah, cleansing flights that kind of cover here, so they may need to cleanse their flights a bit more, and then possible toxicity issues. So ash can be good, but too much ash can be really bad. So if you're kind of curious about different ash contents of honey, I'm happy to share that with you. But I kind of made kind of a quick list of the ash percentage for different types of honey, and you can kind of tell really by the color of the honey. So the lighter the color of the honey, the less ash. The darker the color of the honey, the more ash. So clover honey, which is a common honey source in northern Texas and the Panhandle, its ash content is really low. That the honey is really light and clear colored. Alfalfa honey is very similar to clover, where it's really light, sweet honey. So it also has a lower ash content. Orange blossom, tupelo, sage honey, black locust, which is very common in certain parts of Texas. Basswood is found in certain parts of Texas. These all have really low ash content. So really, in general, there's enough ash to really support colony growth and colony survival, but not causing any issues. Um, but certain types of honey, like buckwheat honey, eucalyptus, palmetto, these are honey that have extremely high ash content. And you look at buckwheat, for example, it can have like, 0.8%, which is really, really high and cause a lot of issues. But yeah, if you compare this to brown sugar, for example, brown sugar has 1%. So brown sugar is actually higher than buckwheat. So that's why brown sugar is really problematic. But yeah, if you have buckwheat honey, it might be a situation where you want to pull that honey and then feed them back because the ash content is too high and it causes some other issues within your colony, especially if that's the only source that you have. Okay, so sugar feeding and what's the exact timing? So I'd say in stage two, I guess I feed. This is kind of my recommendation. Kind of depends on your region, and so I'll talk to a local beekeeper to see maybe how much they feed. So I would recommend men feeding maybe 2 to 4 gallons in the spring, depending on how much I bring in. So I know, especially here in East Texas, we have a lot of pollen coming in, but not as much nectar. Because if you're in an area like the Piney Woods region, or there's a lot of trees, and so the bees are clearly getting a lot of resources from the trees, they might be getting a lot of pollen, but they might not be getting a lot of that nectar. And so in those situations, you might want to feed more often. And even crepe myrtles, for example, the bees get a lot of pollen from the crepe myrtles, but not as much nectar. And so it kind of depends on the really the type of plants, but just in general, the tree type plants produce less nectar and more pollen. And so for us, we're typically feeding maybe 2 to 4 gallons in the spring of a one-to-one solution. So mixing sugar refined sugar with water to produce a one-to-one sugar solution and feeding them somewhere between 2 to 4 gallons. Now, if you have 1 gallon feeders, for example, you'll have to feed them 2 to 4 times. But if you have the 2 gallon feeders, you may only have to feed them once or twice. And so one major benefit of having these larger, feeders is you have to feed them less often. But one downfall is you can fit one less frame. So it kind of depends on your preference. But yeah, I'd probably feed, we're starting to feed right around now because our bees are bringing a lot of pollen. So we're feeding maybe, 1 gallon this week and maybe another gallon in next week or the week after. So, 2 gallons should be enough until you start getting into heavy honey flow, probably into April, into May. And about July and August, you probably don't need a feed. Your bees should probably bring in a lot of resources in the spring and enough to sustain them throughout the summer. But kind of depends on your area. So, if you're splitting really hard in June and your bees aren't bringing a lot of nectar or storing a lot of honey in the spring, you may need to feed more often to make it through the summertime. So, I had a research study in the Hoosier National Forest in southern Indiana. We brought bees up there around May or June, and in the middle of July, the bees had started starving. There just wasn't anything around them because there's a lot of forests. They bring a lot of pollen, and they actually produce a lot of nectar in the spring. But once we got into the summertime, they went through that store really quickly because there's really nothing around other than trees. And so we had to feed them a lot more to make it through the summertime before we had that fall flow. So it really depends on your area. And maybe, like if you're in El Paso, for example, you may have to feed more in the summertime. I know generally here in the eastern part of Texas and certain parts of Texas, feeding and storing honey in the spring is more than enough to make it through the summertime. And then stage four might feed maybe somewhere between 2 to 4 gallons in the fall, depending how much you pull or how light the colonies are. So we typically feed a 2-to-1 sugar solution. So we want to make the sugar more concentrated. And this allows the bees to store more of that sugar and put more weight on the colony. So we'll feed a lot more in the fall to help the bees prepare for the winter. So one reason we feed 1-to-1 to help the bees brood up and basically draw out that foundation. 2-to-1 is more to put more weight on the colony. This I got this from I think Alcorn. This is a really great way to know how to make a 1-to-1 solution versus a 2-to-1 solution. So, I'll put this in the manual or kind of send out afterwards. But if you're not quite sure how to make a 1-to-1 versus 2-to-1, this is kind of how to do it. So if you only plan on making a gallon, you can mix 8 pounds to 1 gallon and so on. So this kind of gives you an idea how to make a 1-to-1 versus a 2-to-1. So generally for right now, you want to make a 1-to-1 solution. And if you have bees already, you might want to feed them, 2 gallons over the next, 2 to 3 weeks. Okay. Next, I want to talk about, well, actually, let's, before we get into this, let's take a 10-minute break. There's not like a clear spot to stop in the middle of this. And so let's take a quick break since we're halfway through, and we'll come back at 10:40 before we get into the toxicity in nectar and some of the other things related to feeding.